Have you ever, just looked at a house, like any house, and wondered what secrets it might be hiding?
Oh, yeah, all the time. Every house has a story.
Well, today, we are going to take that curiosity to a quiet Tokyo suburb, where one December night, over 2 decades ago, a chilling mystery unfolded that continues to baffle investigators and the public to this day. Get ready for your deep dive into the Setagaya family murders.
I'm ready. It's a case that, as you say, confronts us with this really disturbing mix of the everyday and the inexplicable. Like, how could something so horrific happen in a place that seems so ordinary?
Right. And, to kind of unpack that complexity, we'll be using the Wikipedia entry on the Setagaya family murders as our guide for this deep dive. And even though it's, like a straightforward source, you'd be surprised at the layers of intrigue and the number of unanswered questions that it contains.
Totally. Sometimes the simplest sources can lead to the most complex stories.
Absolutely. So at the heart of this mystery, we have the Miyazawa family. Mikio, 44 years old, an office worker. His wife, Yasuko, 41, she was a cooter. Their 8-year-old daughter, Nina, and their 6-year-old son, Ray, who had some developmental challenges. They lived in a typical 2-story house with an attic located in a residential area of Setagaya called Kamisoshigaya. Just picture it a normal house
Yeah.
right next to a playground and pretty close to Komazawa University's baseball fields.
Yeah, a really normal, almost idyllic setting, which makes what happened all the more unsettling. On the night of December 30th, 2000, that sense of peace was just shattered in such a brutal and, to some extent, incomprehensible way. Like 4 lives were just taken. And yet, the perpetrator or perpetrators left behind so much forensic evidence. But despite a massive police investigation involving over 280,000 officers, the case remains unsolved.
It really is just mind-blowing the scale of the investigation.
Yeah.
And yet, still unsolved. So,
Okay.
let's start breaking this down. How the intruder got into the house raises like an immediate question mark. They entered around 11:00 p.m. through a small bathroom window on the second floor. Not exactly the most obvious entry point, right?
Yeah, it's a choice that could suggest a level of planning or at least some prior knowledge of the house's layout, right? You wouldn't just stumble upon that window.
Exactly. And what happened next is even more chilling. So according to the police reconstruction, little Ray was the first victim. He was strangled in his sleep. And what's so disturbing is that he's the only family member who wasn't stabbed. What do you make of that difference in method?
That's a huge question, right? Why a different method for Ray? It could point to a different relationship with the child or a specific intention. Like maybe the perpetrator wanted to avoid the noise of a struggle or the sight of blood. It's such a dark detail that really invites a lot of speculation.
Definitely.
Hmm.
And then Mikio was the next victim. He was found near the first floor staircase right by his office. He'd been stabbed multiple times all over his body. The cause of death was massive blood loss. Then, Yasuko and Nina, who were sleeping in the attic, they were attacked with the same extreme violence, suffering numerous stab wounds, even after they were already dead.
And the really scary part, the investigators determined that the weapons used were a sashimi knife and a santoku knife that were found in the family's own kitchen.
Wow. Using weapons from inside the house is often associated with more impulsive or crimes of passion, but the sheer ferocity of the attack, especially the post-mortem wounds, they point to a really specific kind of rage or cruelty. Like, was there a personal vendetta against the family?
Yeah, that's the big question, and here is where the story gets even stranger. After committing the murders, the killer stayed in the house for several hours. Several. They ate ice cream from the freezer, they drank barley tea from the fridge, they even used the family's first aid kit. What possible explanation could there be for such bizarre behavior? Yeah, this part is just mind-boggling. It completely defies the logic of someone who has just committed such a brutal crime and who should, logically, want to get away as fast as possible. Like, staying at the crime scene for that long? I don't know, maybe it suggests a need for control or maybe a total lack of fear of getting caught.
Yeah.
It's almost arrogant, you know?
It's like they were taunting the police almost. And there's more. They inspected and destroyed some family documents in Mikio's office. And get this, they left Mikio's wallet and house keys in the second-floor toilet tank after using it without flushing. I mean, it's disturbing and just defies any kind of conventional criminal explanation. What do you think they were trying to achieve with these contradictory actions?
It's almost like they wanted to leave their mark, but in this really chaotic and messy way.
Right.
Like the destroyed documents could hint at an attempt to erase specific information, maybe some family secret. And the toilet thing, I mean, it's a total disregard for leaving behind biological evidence. But then they wore gloves during the actual murders. This mix of caution and carelessness is truly strange.
Absolutely. But perhaps the most surprising detail of all is the internet activity. At 1:18 a.m., the killer used Mikio's personal computer. They created a new folder and visited several websites. And this is the last known action of the intruder. Later on, around 10:00 a.m., when Yasuko's mother arrived, there was another accidental internet access. So what do you think the killer was looking for on that computer?
The computer usage in this context is fascinating. Were they searching for information, trying to erase digital traces, or was it just an impulsive act without any real purpose? The creation of a new folder, that could be key. What was in that folder? Unfortunately, we just don't know. And that later access, it tells us they were definitely gone by then.
It was Haruko, Yasuko's mother, who discovered the bodies around 10 a.m. after she couldn't reach her daughter by phone. The first police report was made at 10:56 a.m. You can just imagine the scene, the mother's anguish. And as you mentioned earlier, the police were confronted with a mountain of evidence. There were just so many traces left at the crime scene. It was almost paradoxical because it seems like this abundance of clues might have actually hindered the initial investigation.
That's a good point. A huge amount of forensic evidence can be a double-edged sword. Like, on the one hand, it offers so much potential for identification. But on the other, it can divert attention away from more traditional investigative avenues, things that rely more on human testimony and memories and observations from neighbors or people close to the family.
Right. And speaking of those initial avenues, there were actually two potential sightings that were reported, but both were ultimately dismissed. One woman claimed to have seen a man leaving the house around 11:30 p.m. She said he almost ran into her car and then just took off running. And the following day, in Nikko, a man was treated for a serious knife wound to his hand. However, the police determined that neither of these incidents were connected to the Miyazawa murders. So what do you make of the fact that these initial leads led nowhere?
I think it really emphasizes how isolated and targeted this crime seems to have been. It's as if the perpetrator was completely focused on the Miyazawa family and their home, and any external events, as tragic as they might be, they just didn't fit the profile or the timeline of the murders.
Yeah, it's like they had tunnel vision. So let's go back to that mountain of evidence, though. The killer left several personal belongings at the house. A hip bag, made in Korea between 1995 and 1999, a very worn scarf, some Slazenger sports shoes, also made in Korea, and those shoes were never sold in Japan. There was a long-sleeve shirt, of which very few were ever sold, a wool hat, a Uniqlo jacket, and black gloves. So were these abandoned items valuable clues, or are they just red herrings?
I think each item could potentially be a piece of the puzzle. The Korean origin of several of them is definitely significant, possibly pointing to the killer's nationality or connections. And the rarity of that shirt, if someone had recognized it, that could have been huge. They're like breadcrumbs that the killer unintentionally left behind.
Yeah, it's true. And forensic analysis of those items revealed even more intriguing details. There were traces of the French perfume Dracar Noir on a handkerchief. Dracar Noir was not a common fragrance in Japan at the time. And then in the jacket pockets, they found bird droppings and leaves from Zelkova serrata and salix trees. What can we infer from such specific findings?
The perfume suggests a certain, I don't know, socioeconomic level, or at least access to imported goods.
Right, and the natural traces, the bird droppings and the leaves, they could indicate places the perpetrator frequented before the crime. Maybe a park or a rural area with those specific types of trees and birds, like little clues that open windows into their possible routine or their environment.
Right. And speaking of clues, the police did manage to obtain some security footage from December 29th at Kichiji Station in Musashino, and the footage shows a young man, probably in his 20s or 30s, with short hair, leaving the area where the sashimi knife used in the crime was purchased. Now, the image quality was pretty bad, but it did suggest that the perpetrator might live near the Chu and Kichu train lines west of the city. So how significant is this visual evidence, even with its poor quality? I think it's one of the few concrete visual leads that the police have. Like, even though direct identification wasn't possible, it does narrow down the potential geographic location of the killer and directly links them to the purchase of the murder weapon. It's a thread to pull on, even if the image isn't crystal clear.
It's something. So let's talk about one of the biggest puzzles in this case, the lack of a clear motive. Robbery was ruled out as the primary motive because only 1,500 yen was taken, leaving over 190,000 yen behind in the house. So given the brutality of the murders, revenge seems like a more likely motive, wouldn't you say?
The extreme violence, especially the overkill on Yasuko and Nina, it really leans towards some kind of personal vendetta, deep-seated anger directed at the family or maybe a specific family member. The sheer number of stab wounds really suggests a visceral hatred.
And this is where a more specific theory comes in. The investigative journalist Fumiya Ichihashi proposed that the killer could be a former member of the South Korean military working as a hitman. Now, it's important to emphasize that this is just one of many theories that have been put forward, but it is based on some of the elements we've discussed, like the Korean origin of certain objects found at the crime scene. So what do you think about this theory? Does it hold water for you?
The Ichihashi theory is definitely interesting, and it's generated a lot of debate. The discipline and the coldness associated with military training could explain, to some extent, I don't know, the clinical execution of the crimes, but there's no conclusive evidence to support it definitively, so it remains a possibility within the realm of the unknown.
A possibility, among many.
Yeah.
So DNA analysis conducted in 2005 did establish that the perpetrator has partial European ancestry on their maternal side, specifically from Southern Europe or the Adriatic area, and East Asian ancestry on their paternal side.
Mm.
And their blood type is A, the most common blood type in Japan. So what are the implications of this unusual genetic finding?
I think this finding is both fascinating and frustrating. On one hand, it gives us this partial genetic profile of the killer, but on the other, that mix of ancestries really complicates the search for matches in existing DNA databases. It's not a common genetic profile in Japan, so could we be looking for someone with international connections or maybe an unusual family background?
Right. And despite having compared over 8 million fingerprints, none matched those found at the crime scene, strongly suggesting that the killer did not have a prior criminal record in Japan. So what conclusions can we draw from this absence of known fingerprints?
The absence of a criminal record in Japan doesn't necessarily mean that the perpetrator never committed a crime elsewhere or that they've never had any contact with law enforcement. They just weren't in the Japanese police database. It could point to someone who isn't a habitual resident of Japan or who, for whatever reason, has never been fingerprinted by Japanese authorities. It's a really interesting detail.
Yeah, it really is. So based on all the evidence gathered in that security footage from Musashino, the police developed a general profile of this suspect. At the time of the murders, they would have been between 15 and 35 years old, approximately 170 centimeters tall, with short dark hair, right-handed, and possibly of Korean origin.
Do you think this profile, after so many years, is still useful for the investigation?
I mean, while it does offer some key parameters, the age range is pretty wide, and the physical characteristics aren't particularly distinctive. The possible Korean ancestry remains a relevant line of inquiry given the objects that were found, but the lack of any matches so far suggests that maybe there's a key piece of the puzzle missing. And in 2015, 15 years after the murders, the Tokyo police held a solemn ceremony near the Miyazawa home to commemorate the victims. To date, over 15,000 tips have been received from the public, and the police are continuing to conduct DNA testing and fingerprint comparisons against new databases as they become available. The reward for any information leading to an arrest is currently 20 million yen. So do you think after all this time there's still hope of solving this case?
I think the persistence of the police and the public's willingness to come forward with information, those are crucial. Like the fact that even after all these years, they're actively pursuing new leads. It really shows the profound impact this crime had on Japanese society and that commitment to finding answers. And you never know, forensic technology is always advancing, so a new test or a new connection could completely change things.
You never know. And in 2022, the podcast Faceless by Nicholas Obergon was released, and it investigates the case in depth, and it really questions a lot of the initial assumptions about the case. So this shows that public and investigative interest in this chilling mystery is still very much alive over 2 decades later.
Yeah.
What role do you think these kinds of media initiatives play in solving cold cases?
Initiatives like this podcast are so important for keeping the memory of the case alive in the public consciousness. And who knows, maybe someone out there has relevant information but has been hesitant to come forward, and hearing or reading about the case again could be that little push they need. Sometimes the smallest detail that seemed insignificant at the time can turn out to be crucial years later.
It's true. So we've reached the end of our deep dive into a mystery that continues to chill. A brutal crime, a wealth of forensic clues, and yet no resolution after over 2 decades. What's especially perplexing is the duality of the perpetrator's behavior at the crime scene, like extreme violence coexisting with moments of chilling normalcy. What do you find most disturbing about that contrast?
It's that very contradiction that makes it so unsettling and hard to grasp. Like this blend of meticulous planning with impulsive, almost grotesque actions. What kind of mind is capable of such brutality and yet is capable of such mundane things as, eating ice cream or browsing the internet? That disconnect between the horror and the ordinary, that's what makes it such an enduring mystery.
And I want to ask you, our listener now, what aspects of this deep dive into the Setagaya family murders stood out to you the most? Was it the killer's seemingly contradictory actions? The unusual